Hello, so this is part two of the recorded discussion on internal control structure and management philosophy. So the bulk of the discussion actually is in this part, which talks about the components of internal control. So, in the first part of the recorded discussion, we have learned what is internal control. So, we have defined what is internal control, and we also discussed why internal control is important in a company and who are the persons involved in the development and implementation of internal control, and who is the person that is ultimately responsible for the um, correct implementation of internal control. So at this point, we will now be learning what are the components of internal control. So there are five interrelated components that comprise internal control. If these five components are present and functioning effectively, their effective functioning provides reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the company's objectives. Thus, these components are all necessary for effective internal control to be present. So, in order for us daw to be kampante ba nga sakto o work yun ang ato ang internal control nga gi-implement, kanis lang lima ka components must be present. So I know that you have heard of these five components before, but let's just memorize them. So there are five components of internal control. The first one is the control environment. And then the second one is the risk assessment. Third, control activities. And fourth, we have information and communication. And then lastly is, sorry. Yeah, and then the fifth one is the monitoring activities. So again, control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. So within these five components are embedded 17 principles. So 17 principles. So we will be discussing these 17 principles and which of these principles fall under a specific component of internal control. So at this point, you can pause the video to to give you time to memorize and familiarize yourselves with these five components of internal control. So again, we have control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. So let's discuss the first component. The first component is the control environment. So the control environment includes the standards, processes, and structures that provide the foundation for carrying out internal control. So this is the foundation. So it's like building a house, no? So ang internal control, where siya mag-build ka og balay. So unahon ni mo daan ang foundation. So the foundation, that is your control environment. The board of directors and senior management are responsible for establishing the tone at the top. So, tone at the top meaning unsa ang ato ang culture, tone at the top, including expected standards of conduct that apply to all employees. Management is responsible for reinforcing the expectations at all levels of the organization. So the first principle falls under your control environment. So the first principle is this: they demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. They set a positive tone at the top by communicating verbally and by example. So, how do they communicate? How do the board of directors and senior management communicate? Either verbally or by example, as well as formally. So, pwede nila istorya or bisag without saying it, you can see it by their actions. So, by example, as well as formally. Formally in a sense nga naadjud tay published um, policies and procedures with respect to a specific activity. the organization. So unsa man ilang i-communicate, unsa may i-communicate ni board of directors and senior management. Ang ilang i-communicate kay ang organization's ethical values and commitment to integrity. So more on integrity and ethics. Every company should establish standards of conduct and formal policies regarding acceptable business practices, conflicts of interest, and expected standards of behavior. However, these official statements state only what management wants to have happen. So mo ni siya ato ang ganahan. Okay, ang nakabutang diri sa ato ang established standards of conduct and formal policies, mo ni siya atong expected, mo ni siya atong ganahan. Corporate culture or the tone at the top determines what actually does happen. So, mao ni atong gistorya, no? Mao ni atong ganahan, mao ni ang gibutang nato sa standards of conduct and policies nato. So, mao ni siya atong expectations. Pero kung unsa man gani ang actual, so expectation versus reality. So, ang reality, ang what actually does happen is determined by the tone at the top or corporate culture. So the top management, especially the CEO, sets the ethical tone by modeling the ethical and behavioral standards expected of everyone in the organization. So this is actually leadership by example. So kung unsay makita ninyo sa inyong leader, di ba? Most of the time, kung unsay behavior or attitude sa leader, mao man sad siya ang makopya sa iyang members, di ba? So same with business organization. So kaning naa sa kaning mga persons nga occupying the seats in the board as well as in the senior management, they set the tone at the top. So makita nimo if ikaw staff ra ka, makita nimo in-ani magud sila mo deal with this type of problem. In-ani magud sila mo approach. Di magud na sila mapalit. So naa sila integrity and then they uphold their ethical values. So that is what will be followed by the staff o katong mga members sa mga rank and file employees. Ang ilang ikopya is ang behavior, an example sa ilang leaders and not just katong kung unsa man gani gisuwat didto sa ato ang established standards. So kung ang leaders mismo wala sila ni follow sa ilahang gi-establish nga standards of conduct, dili po na siya expected nga i-follow sa ato ang mga employees. So management should foster a control consciousness by setting formal and clearly communicated policies and procedures to be followed at all times without exception. And that result in shared values and teamwork. Kaya if leader ka, for example, if you are part of the board of directors, this is what the established procedures say. Pero kuan man gud ko kanang boss good ko or dako good kog position so exempted ko ana din kailangan follow ana. That is wrong, okay? Because your members will follow your example. So if you sets the tone at the top nga okay ra di ay nga dili mo follow sa ato ang policies, then maghuna-huna po ang ato ang members nga ay okay ra di ay kay lax ra man di ay mga rule breakers man di ay taso okay ra di ay. So mo na siya ha, and very important that the BODs and the senior management team should be able to demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. Okay. Then, please read the other paragraphs that would give you additional insights on this principle. So the second principle, which falls under the control environment component, is that the board of directors demonstrate independence from management and exercises oversight over development and performance of internal control. So at this point, you should be able to understand that ang BOD, dili na siya parehas sa management. Okay? Ang BOD, lahi na siya sa management. In fact, the BOD should be independent from management. Dapat dili sila, wala sila close ties. Meaning, ang si BOD, dili siya magsalig kung unsay ganahan sa management and vice versa. They should be independent from each other. So, asa may mas gamhanan? Ang mas gamhanan si Board of Directors. Unsa may role ni Board of Directors? Si Board of Directors, kailangan ba siya manghilabot sa operation sa day-to-day dagan sa business? Answer is no. Ang makapanghilabot no sa day-to-day operation sa business is si management. Si board of directors is responsible only for the oversight. Marbag Ginoo ba nga magtanaw oy nagunsa naman ni sila. Oversight only. But kanang sa mga nitty-gritties, ang responsible kay si management. So, dapat clear ang ilang responsibilities ha. So, si board of directors exercises oversight over the development and performance of internal control. And then, kinsa man ang dapat mo comprise ato ang board of directors. As you have learned in your corporation law, di ba? To become a member of the board of directors, you need to be a shareholder. You need to own at least one share, one stock of that company. But in addition, the board of directors should have a sufficient number of members who are independent from management. This is particularly relevant to public corporations. Kaning mga public companies, kailangan na siya na ay independent directors. So, usually, duha ka independent directors to be able to ensure that the board of directors will remain independent from the management. So, ang head sa board of directors, gitawag na nato siya chairman of the board. Chairman of the board. Ang head sa management, mo siya si president. Okay? And sometimes mo na maglibog ta nga, lahi de, abi na ko parehas na si management o si board. Kay may magog CEO and president. So, it could be that the chairman of the board is also the president of the management team. So, if you can see, head siya sa board, so chairman siya sa board, at the same time, head siya sa management, kay president man siya. So, murag dili kayo siya independent. No, dili kayo ma-carry out ang principle nga dapat si BOD is independent from management. So, that is why kailangan taog sufficient number of members who are actually independent from the management. Meaning, wala sad siya position diri sa management. So, independence of the board for management is very critical so that if necessary, difficult and probing questions will be raised. Kanang di sila maikog mang kumusulti ani oy kay basin ma-offend ni sila or basin lahi ilang interpretation. So, they should be able to perform their tasks without considering what the other team will think. Okay, and then principle number 3, still under control environment. With the oversight of the board, management establishes structures, reporting lines, and appropriate authorities and responsibilities to enable the corporation to pursue its objectives. So, as what I have mentioned a while ago, si board of directors is only more of oversight. Maglantaw lang ba nga? But ang responsible sa nitty-gritties kay si management. So, siya ang dapat maghunahuna kung kani nga task asa man ni nako i-assign nga department. Kinsa man ang akong staff ani nga department. Kinsa may mo head ani nga department and so on. So, kanang mga details si management ang mo layout ana. Okay? So, nganong appeal man ni siya nga principle sa control environment. We go back to the concept that control environment is actually the foundation. No, so hunahuna lang nga nag-set pa kas foundation. So si management magunahuna siya sa unsaon pag-distribute ani nga mga responsibilities, who are the persons responsible for these type of transactions. So iyan ang i-layout sa tanan murag planning sa laying out the game plan. So mo na siyang under na siya sa control environment. The company's organizational structure should define the key areas of authority and responsibility and delineate lines for reporting. So, dapat kay bata kung inani nga report, dapat didto na siya kuhaon ani nga department. If kani, dire pikas nga department. Okay? So authority and responsibility should be delegated to the extent necessary to achieve the organization's objectives. So there should not be concentration of activities. When I say concentration, dili dapat nga kanang inaning tanang bugat nga mga buhatonon ihatag ra nimo ani nga person or ihatag ra nimo ani nga department. So dapat ma-distribute jud siya sa proper persons nga mas mas fit to perform these activities. And then another principle, the organization demonstrates a commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent individuals in alignment with objectives. Because we always go back to the reason nga nung magbutang tao internal control. Again, the purpose is for us to achieve our organization's objectives. And even if ni-perform gyud si board of directors properly sa iyang oversight function ug si management sad na carefully layout niya kani nga mga responsibilities mo na siya diha nga department, kani nga responsibilities sa lahi nga department. But what if dili competent ang ato ang employees? So dili ra gihapon natong ma-achieve atong objectives. We must be able to ensure that the individuals or the employees that we are hiring are competent individuals. So, in order for tasks to be accomplished in accordance with the company's objectives and plans for achievement of those objectives, the company needs to have competent personnel. So, unsaon man na pag sure nga competent, so mga baron ka sa ilang TOR, si HR dapat mo do og background check kung kani siya nga employee kani siya nga applicant kay naabaron siya pending criminal cases or naa siya mga criminal existing criminal reports, whether kani nga applicant kay naka-graduate gyud tinud-unay ug ani nga kurso and so on. So that's how the organization ensure that the individuals or the employees that they are hiring are competent enough to help the organization achieve its objectives. Then principle number 5, the last principle that falls under control environment is this. The organization holds individual accountable for their internal control responsibilities in pursuit of objectives. Diba? I mentioned a while ago that the activities to be performed within the organization, kay i-assign siya sa specific person. So, for example, if ikaw, entrusted ka with this, for example, cashier ka, so, you are tasked to properly safekeep the cash nga imong madawat, nya di siya makuwangan, at the end of the day, wa siya nakuhaan. And if in case makuhaan siya, makuwangan siya, you will be held responsible for it. Dapat walay manghunaw nga. Wala kanang dili ko dapat ma-liable ani. No. Mabita nang sa grocery store, sa mga department store, di ba, ang cashier, kuhaon man na ilahang kwarta from time to time. Let's say, after 4 hours baron of their shift, kuhaon, then i-audit na siya dito sa back office. If naay kuwang ilang tanan ang resibo, tanan nga na issue nga resibo, mao ni ang total, vis-a-vis mao ni ang kwarta sa tahon. If kuwangan, they will become accountable for that. The cashier will become accountable for that. And the discrepancy will be deducted from the cashier's salary. Okay? Component number 2, so manata ni control environment. Component number 2 is risk assessment. Risk assessment is the process of identifying, analyzing, and managing the risks that have the potential to prevent the organization from achieving its objectives relative to the organization's established risk tolerance. So for example, muni ako ang goal. Okay? Pero unsa kahay mga stumble blocks nga ako ang magian nga would prevent me from achieving this goal. So we do risk assessment. Okay. First, you have to identify unsa man ang mga risks involved ani. Kunya, after identifying, assess nga unsa man ni siya nga klase nga risk, makaya ba ni nato or dili? If makaya, what should we do about this? So within the control environment, management is responsible for the assessment of risk. So it is the management that is responsible for the assessment of risks. The question should always be asked, what could go wrong and what assets do we need to protect? So, diba, we have 5 principles under control environment. So we continue. So I've mentioned a while ago that there will be 17 principles embedded sa ato ang 5 components of internal control. So this will be the 6th principle, but this time this falls under risk assessment. First, the company's objectives must be specified clearly enough so that the risks to these objectives can be assessed. So if vague kayo, if general ra kayo ang inyong objective, maglisod sad mo assess kung unsa nga risks ang involved ani. So for example, ang inyong goal kay like ato i-simplify ha sa day-to-day na kuan na day-to-day na scenario. For example, mayon ka na ganahan ko madato. Kanara general kayo ganahan ko madato. It's too vague of a dream. So how can you say nga dato na ka? So you need to set a clear objective. Like for example, ganahan ko maka-earn og 150,000 per month. So at least clear na siya. And then after setting that objective, maka-assess na ka na, in achieving this dream, unsa ka na mga risks akong magian? Unsa ka nga mga butang ang kailangan ako i-face or i-avoid para maka-achieve ko ani nga objective nga makasweldo ko 150,000 per month. Okay? So, the company's objectives must be specified clearly enough. So objective setting is therefore the first step in the management process of risk assessment. So ang step 1 is to clearly set your objective. Step 1 sa risk assessment. Next principle, the organization identifies risks to the achievement of its objectives and analyzes them to determine how the risks should be managed. Okay, so step 1 na kay objective, no? Objective. After na imong i-identify ang mga risks involved. After nimo ma-identify, you can now analyze. So identify first and then analyze. So ang first buhaton is to identify. So risk identification. Risk identification includes identification of risks at all levels of the organizational structure, including the overall entity and its subunits. So, entity level risk, meaning overall, as an entity, unsa man ang risks involved. So, this could arise from external, or the risks could come from or could result from external or internal factors. So, the following are a few examples. So, kung external factor, meaning a factor that is outside the company's control. For example, economic factors that impact financing availability, environmental factors such as climate change that can require changes in operations, reduced availability of raw materials, loss of information system, and so on, regulatory changes. So these are things outside the company that the company cannot control, but they are existing. They pose risks to our company. There are factors that are also internal to the company. This can include decisions that affect operations and the availability of infrastructure, changes in management responsibilities that affect the way controls are implemented, changes in personnel that can influence the control consciousness in the organization, employees' access to assets. So everything that is going on inside the company's premises that could pose a risk to the company not to achieve its objectives. So that's for entity level. We also have transaction level risks. Ang transaction level risk, these are risks that occur at the level of subsidiaries, divisions, operating units, or functions. So very specific. Okay. functions, let's say sales, unsa man ang risks involved aning sa sale sa ato ang conduct of sales activities, production or marketing. So for example, um, an operational objective of maintaining an adequate raw materials inventory could lead to identifying risks such as raw materials not meeting specifications, the failure of a key supplier, supply disruptions in needed raw materials caused by weather conditions. So for example, we are into manufacturing. So since manufacturing man ta, mga inahanglan ta raw materials. Sa pagpalit na to raw materials, it could be nga ang i-deliver is batik. So kung bati ang raw materials, that means bati sa ang ato ang product. So that is a transaction level risk. Kay very, very specific to the production process. Or it could be na malate og deliver ang raw materials. So, na late ang delivery sa raw materials, malate sa ta og produce ato ang product. Or nikalit og increase og price sa supplier. So, if mo increase ang price sa supplier sa ato raw materials, understandably, mudako sad ang ato ang product cost. If mudako atong product cost, there is a chance nga the customer is ato ang customer will not be anymore attracted na sa ato ang product because kay mahal naman siya because sa pag-increase sa raw materials. So those are transaction level risks. So first we identify the risk. After we have identified the risk, we will now analyze. So risk analysis. After the company has identified its entity level and transaction level risks, it should perform a risk analysis to what? To assess the likelihood or frequency of each risks occurring. So for example, nabitay risk nga na-delay si supplier o deliver sa ato kay bagyo manggod. So you have to assess the likelihood or frequency nga. Permi ba magbagyo? Permi ba din siya, kani siya nga risk nga ma-delay because sa bagyo? How often will it occur? Kada kanus aman ta mag-face ani nga risks? Naa ba na permi or usahay ra? Estimate the impact of each risk. So if may tabo ni nga risk, unsa may effect ana nato sa ato ang company? So you also have to analyze that. Consider how each risk should be managed by assessing what actions need to be taken. So kaning actions need to be taken, nara tayo actually upat ka actions. Acceptance, avoidance, reduction, sharing. So you either accept the risk, avoid the risk, reduce the risk, or share or transfer the risk to some other persons. So for acceptance, no action is taken to affect the likelihood or impact of the risk. So if kaya ra nga i-accept na lang. Avoidance, totally exiting the activity or activities that give rise to the risk, like 100% hawaon jud mo siya. Reduction is hawaon ra nimo gamay, pero na kay pabilin. Action is taken to reduce the likelihood or impact of the risk. Sharing or transferring, reducing the risk likelihood or impact by transferring or sharing the risk, such as purchasing insurance or forming a joint venture. Okay, so this is actually our risk analysis matrix. So on the x-axis here, the impact, this is our x-axis. Here is low and high, and then probability of occurring. Okay, diba? First, you have to analyze the likelihood or frequency of each risks occurring. So that actually is your y-axis. Here, the probability is low on this part and high at this part. Second, the impact of each risk. So is the impact low or high? From this matrix, we can actually decide what action has to be taken. So it's here. If the probability is low, meaning low ra ang chance nga mahitabo ni siya nga risk, or mahitabo ni siya nga event. And then if ever magari mahitabo siya, gamay ra sa siya impact, low ra yang impact. So our action is to accept na lang. This is acceptable to us. Kay low man yung probability niya, low sa iyahang impact. What if high probability, meaning dako ang chance nga mahitabo ni siya nga event. Nya, ang iyang impact, although mahitabo siya, na siya high chance nga mahitabo, pero gamay ra iyang impact, So we can actually reduce na lang. So dili totally na i-avoid na to siya. We can accept part of it and reject some other part of it to reduce. If the probability is low, probability of it occurring is low, but the impact is high, we can transfer it. So for example, there is a risk nga basin masunog ang ato ang warehouse. Na by chance nga masunog atong warehouse? Yes. But ang probability of it occurring is very low, correct? Nga once in a blue moon raman masunog na. So the probability is low. But once nga mahitabo gyud na siyang event, the impact will be high. Kaya masunog tanan, dako kay tag loss. So, low probability, high impact, our best action to take is to transfer or share the risk. That is why we get insurance. If in the event, nga kanon ato ang warehouse of fire, at least makakuha the compensation from the insurance company. If the probability of an event occurring is high and the impact is also high, so dili siya worth it. We can just avoid it. Okay, so that's the action to take. Another principle under risk assessment: in assessing the risks to the achievement of its objectives, management of the organization should consider the potential for fraud. Okay, so ang fraud manggod is very bugat, meaning even if sakto jud unta ang imuhang pag-implement sa internal control, but if naadjay fraudulent intention ang isa ka person or group of persons to perpetrate something nga makadaot sa company, then buhaton gina nila. No, so si management should consider the potential for fraud. So, for example, di ba, we learn in our segregation, in your AIS, second year siguro na or first year ninyo, mga subject sa AIS, under segregation of duties, custody must be separate from recording. So, ang custody meaning ikaw ang nag-hold ana ba? So for example, if ikaw na ay custody sa cash, ikaw na gunit sa kwarta, dapat dili ikaw ang tig-record. Okay? So custody must be separate from recording. But for example, ang custodian, cash custodian, is the wife of the person that is in charge for the recording. Pwede rin gyapon sila mag-collude. So there is potential for fraud. So even if na-comply jud unta nato segregate jud nato ang custody from reporting, but pwede man mag-collude ang ato ang employees. So the management should also consider that. Another principle under risk assessment: the organization identifies and assesses changes that could impact the organization system of internal control. As what we have learned in part 1 discussion, no nga, internal control should be flexible. So if there are any changes that could if there are any changes that have happened or occurred within the company, the internal control must also be able to adapt itself to the change. So the organization or the company must be able to identify and assess the changes that could actually lead to the changing of the internal control as well. So kung mo-grow si company, mo-grow, mo-develop, or mo-evolve sa dapat ang ilahang internal control. So that's it for risk assessment. The third component is control activities. Control activities. So control activities are actions established by policies and procedures that help ensure the management's instructions intended to limit risks to the achievement of the organization's objectives to be carried out. So, di ba, ang first two component of internal control, we have control environment and risk assessment. Kani sila, murag mental pa ni siya nga phase. When mental pa siya nga stage, nga period ba. Control environment man god, i-set out sa nimo ang foundation, no? Hunahunaon sa nimo ba, layout nimo. Risk assessment, hunahunaon ra gyapon. Hunahunaon nimo unsa kay risks involved, no? And then unsa kay impact ani nga risk? Yeah, if naani siya nga risk, unsa man atong buhaton. So more on mental pa siya na aspect. Control activities is the actual doing. Unsa atong buhaton, unsa ang ato ang responsibilities mo ni siya ato ang control activities. This is the actual work. So the next principle is that the organization selects and develops control activities that contribute to reducing to acceptable levels the identified risks to the achievement of its objectives. So we have actually preventive controls and detective controls. So preventive, to help us prevent the occurrence of an unfavorable event. Ang detective is, if in case man kanina ay nahitabo nga bati nga incident sa ato ang company, we must be able to detect it. So for example, if naikawat nga nahitabo, dapat makit-an na to, dapat ma-detect na to nga ala na ay nangawat. So for example, we do reconciliations, we do audits, we do physical count. Next principle, under control activities, the organization selects and develops general control activities over technology to support the achievement of its objectives. Most of the companies now are using technology, di ba, sa ilang day-to-day operations. So we must also be able to develop control activities over the technology that we are using. Dapat sure jud ta nga kani nga system mo gana gyud siya correctly, mo compute gyud siya correctly, and so on. The next principle is that the organization deploys control activities by deploying policies that establish what is expected and procedures that put the policies into action. The control activities should be built into business process and employees' day-to-day activities. So dapat more siya naatay manual ba nga. Unsa jud itong dapat buhaton. Okay, and then another component of internal control is information and communication. First principle related to this is that the organization should obtain or generate and use relevant quality information to support the functioning of internal control. Okay, so we must be able to communicate with each other properly through, let's say, emails or production reports regarding quality, minutes of meeting, discussing actions. So, dapat na atay mga ingon aning procedures. For external, we can also use those documents from outsourced providers, research reports, from social media, and blog postings. So these information will help us um, make decisions related to the goal of achieving our organization's objectives. Another principle under information and communication is that the organization should internally communicate information, including objectives and responsibilities for internal control necessary to support the functioning of internal control. So, from time to time, we have to remind our employees, if you are part of the BOD or part of the management team, we need to remind our employees of our objectives. Di ba? Kabantay mo na amoy goal. Unya, pag-execute niyo na day-to-day, sometimes you lose track or you lose track of the goal. Makalimot mo ba nga, amo mo din yung goal. So you need to be reminded from time to time. So that is why we can call for meetings. Let's say every week, mag-call of meeting or every month to assess unsay atong performance so far and hit ba na to tong targets, and if wala, unsay kailangan nato buhaton para in next period mahit na nato tong mga targets. Okay. And then another principle under information and communication, the organization should communicate with external parties regarding matters affecting the functioning of internal control. So remember that, diba, we can get information from external parties, including shareholders, partners, owners, regulators, customers, financial analysts, and other external parties. We can obtain information from them to help us decide whether there are some aspects of our internal control that are not working properly, and if yes, if there are, how should we address these discrepancies? So for example, you can have a whistleblower hotline. Para, for example, if there are employees who are colluding with each other and then someone else knew about it, at least that person can report the incident anonymously. At least walay risk to himself ba. So that's part of information and communication as well. And then the last component of our internal control is monitoring activities. So finally, management must monitor the entire control system. So dili ra pasagdan, no? Dapat i-monitor yun na siya from time to time. Okay, so the last remaining principles are the following. The organization selects, develops, and performs ongoing evaluations, separate evaluations, and some combination of both to ascertain whether the 5 components of internal control are present and functioning. So how can they do this? Monitoring can be done in 2 ways. First, through ongoing evaluations that are built into business process during normal operations and provide timely information. So if you are using a system, a computer system, pwede na siya i-program in such a way that the system itself will generate the report so that the management can see nga mao ni siya ang mga red flags. Or through separate evaluation conducted periodically by management with the assistance of the internal audit function. So the management can contact the internal audit team and ask them to perform regular audit particular aspect of the organization and then come up with a report so that the management team can know whether a specific aspect of the organization has been working as intended. And then the last principle is that the organization evaluates and communicates internal control deficiencies in a timely manner to parties responsible for corrective action, including senior management and the board of directors as appropriate. So based on the reports that the management has received, if nadre mga discrepancies nga, oy, murag daghan kaayo na waste nga raw materials, naguba nga raw materials, so i-communicate na niya sa persons responsible so that the person responsible could perform a corrective action nga how to address this discrepancy. Okay? So this is the summary of the 5 components and the 17 principles of internal control. You can go over that on your own. And then, okay, so what is effective internal control? An effective internal control system provides reasonable assurance regarding achievement of an entity's objectives by reducing to an acceptable level the risk of not achieving an entity's objective. So actually, this just revolves around the definition of internal control, diba? And then the concepts of the 5 components of the internal control together with the relevant 17 principles. Okay, so here are examples of transaction control activities. I think these are very much self-explanatory. You have gone over this during your AIS class naman. So authorization, all transactions are approved by someone with the authority. So for example, ganahan ta mag-write off of accounts receivable. So kinsa ra may authorized to write off. So dapat siya sad ang pwede maka-write off, makapa-reduce sa accounts receivable balance. Completeness, all valid transactions are included. Accuracy, we have validity, physical safeguards and security, error handling, and segregation of duties. Okay, so here are some safeguarding controls. We have segregation of duties, physical protection and controlled access to records and documents, physical protection measures to restrict access, and then effective supervision and independent checks and verification. So with respect to segregation of duties, here are the things that you need to remember. So different people must always perform the following 4 functions of related activities. Dili ni siya kani siya nga mga activities or mga roles, dili ni siya pwede ihatag sa isa ka person ra. Dapat separate jud, dili pwede mag-merge. So authorizing a transaction, record keeping, physical custody of the related asset, periodic reconciliation of physical assets. Okay, so kinsa mo authorize, dili siya dapat ang mo record. Kinsa ang naay custody, dili siya dapat ang mo record. Kinsa ang tig-reconcile, dili sa siya pwede dapat siya tig-record. Siya mo record, siya pa mo reconcile. So dili na siya independent nga verification. So kailangan kani siyang upat must be performed by different persons. So you can actually see here examples of potential internal control failures if there are inadequate segregation of duties. If wala na follow ang proper segregation of duties, mao ni siya ang mga failures nga possible nga mahitabo sa company. So you can read this on your own. Okay, and then we do physical protection. For example, naatay check checkbook. Nya gisign na nadaan dira ang checkbook. Mao na usual mahitabo no gisign na nadaan pero walay name sa payee, walay amount. So dapat dili anyone can access the checkbook. Kato lang mga authorized persons ang maka-access sa checkbook. Kaya if anyone can access the checkbook, then you can issue a check to yourself na on account of the company. So there must be controlled access to records and documents. Restricted as access to assets. So if there are cash, for example, it should be kept in a locked, fireproof file cabinet or safe under controlled access. So, dili pwede nga ibutang na stable. No, part-time ka na stable, dapat na-adjust siya sa kahon nga na ay lock and so on. So, there must be a restriction as to who can get access or can obtain access to assets. So, here are examples. You can read this on your own. And then lastly, we have effective supervision and independent checks and verification. So, katong gipang record sa isa, dapat na ay someone else nga mo verify. Sakto ba? So, for example, sa expenditure cycle, let's say, ang nadawat nato from the supplier, 100 ka buok na materials. Ang gi-order out, let's say, balik, ang gi-order nato 100. So, ang gi-order nato, this is evidenced by our purchase order. Ang nadawat nato 98. Ang nadawat nato nga 98, this is evidenced by the receiving report, no? So someone else has prepared the purchase order, someone else has prepared the receiving report, and ikaw lahi pud nga person, you have to reconcile them. Imo siya i-compare. So that is supervision and independent checks and verification. So imo i-compare, oy, ang PO 100, purchase order 100, ang RR or ang receiving report 98. So at least ma-check na to nga kuwang di ay ang gipadala ni supplier. Okay, and then we can rectify that. So that's the role of this third safeguarding control. So that ends our topic, internal control, structure, and management philosophy. Thank you so much, and I hope you learned something from our two-part discussion. Thank you.